Honestly, Trayvon, don't you think you should have chosen an outfit more appropriate for Dad's funeral? Victoria's voice cut through the respectful silence of the wake like a sharp blade. She stood beside the polished mahogany coffin, her blue eyes scanning my black suit with barely concealed disdain. I mean, she continued, adjusting her inherited pearls, I know people like you do the best they can, but this is a serious ceremony. Maybe next time you can borrow something of better quality so you don't clash with the surroundings. The main hall of Whitmore and Associates Funeral Home grew even quieter. 30 pairs of eyes turned to us, some curious, some embarrassed. My wife Jessica froze beside me, her face turning pale as her family processed her older sister's words. My name is Trayvon, I'm 34 years old, and I just got publicly humiliated at my father-in-law's funeral because of the color of my skin. But as Victoria smiled with that venomous superiority I had known for 8 years of marriage, I kept my expression perfectly neutral. She had no idea she was digging her own grave on ground I had purchased years earlier. You're right, Victoria, I replied calmly, smoothing the Italian silk tie that cost more than her monthly salary as a secretary. Appearances really do matter on occasions like this. She blinked, surprised by my peaceful response. She expected confrontation, tears, maybe me running away like a wounded coward. What she didn't know was that I had learned long ago that true power comes from strategic silence, especially when you have cards that no one suspects exist. The patriarch of the Thompson family was being mourned at the most expensive funeral home in Richmond, Virginia. The flowers cost $15,000. The coffin, $30,000. The entire ceremony, including the rental of the main hall for 2 days, totaled $87,000. Victoria thought she was going all out financially to honor her father's memory. She didn't know that I had paid for every penny. Trayvon always tries so hard, Jessica murmured, trying to ease the tension. Her voice trembled slightly, a sign that she, too, was beginning to tire of the family's constant taunts. Oh, I'm sure he does, Victoria laughed, a crystal-clear fake sound. It must be hard trying to fit in when you come from, well, where you come from. Other family members began to shift uncomfortably. Uncle Robert checked his watch. Cousin Linda feigned sudden interest in the flowers. Even Grandma Dorothy, normally deaf to anything that wasn't about her stock market holdings, was paying attention. But no one said a word. No one defended me. Not even my wife. This didn't surprise me. In 8 years of attending family reunions, Christmas dinners, and elaborate birthday parties, I had become an expert at reading the Thompson family's discomfort. They tolerated my presence because Jessica loved me, but they could never completely hide the fact that they saw me as a temporary accident in their impeccable lineage. What they didn't understand was that while they treated me like an unwanted intruder, I had been building something that would completely transform the family dynamic they cherished so much. Well, said Victoria, adjusting the black veil on her hat, at least now that Dad is gone, maybe we can finally have some honest conversations about the future of the family. Her words carried a weight that went beyond simple racial provocation. There was a promise there, a veiled threat that without the moderating presence of the patriarch, the true feelings of the Thompson family could finally be expressed freely. If you're following this story of resistance and revelations that will shake an entire family, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happens next will show you that underestimating someone can be the most costly mistake of your life. As Victoria continued her show of moral superiority, she discreetly checked the time on my Patek Philippe, a gift I had bought myself after closing my third 8-figure deal. It was almost noon. In exactly 6 hours, the reading of the will would reveal secrets that would turn that smug smile into something completely different. Victoria wasn't just racist, she was strategic in her prejudice. During the 8 years I had been around the Thompson family, I had learned to recognize her patterns. She never made openly hostile comments in front of the patriarch. My father-in-law James Thompson had made it clear from the beginning that zero tolerance for explicit discrimination was a non-negotiable family rule. But James was dead now. And Victoria finally felt free to reveal who she really was. Trayvon dear, she continued, her voice sweet as poisoned syrup, you must be anxious about the reading of the will tonight. I hope you're not expecting too much. Daddy was always very traditional in his decisions. The funeral parlor grew even more tense. Distant cousins exchanged uncomfortable glances. Aunt Margaret feigned sudden interest in her silk handkerchief. Uncle Robert, who had always treated me with superficial cordiality, avoided my gaze entirely. Jessica finally found her voice. Victoria, this is not the time or place for For what, Jess? For honesty. Victoria laughed, a crystalline sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. Look, we all know Dad included Trayvon in the will for appearances. A small sum, maybe some of the old books. But let's be realistic about expectations. She gestured vaguely in my direction, as if I were a piece of furniture that had lost its value over time. The main property, the investments, the business, those things stay in the family. The real family. The words cut through the air like sharp knives. Even the funeral home staff, accustomed to family dramas, seemed uncomfortable with such explicit cruelty. But I kept my expression neutral, remembering all the other times I had swallowed similar insults. Like at Christmas 2019, when Victoria joked that I should be grateful for getting a white wife from a good family. Or on Jessica's birthday in 2021, when she asked if I really thought I deserved to be at that 5-star restaurant. Each comment had been carefully calibrated, cruel enough to hurt, but subtle enough to allow plausible deniability if questioned. Victoria has a point, whispered Cousin Linda, breaking the uncomfortable silence. I mean, Dad's will was written a long time ago. Before certain changes in the family. Certain changes. My marriage to Jessica. The code was clear to everyone in the room. I was the unwanted change, the outside element that had disrupted the racial harmony of the Thompson dynasty. We don't want you to feel bad when you find out that your expectations were unrealistic, added Cousin Linda, her fake sympathy even more nauseating than Victoria's open hostility. Jessica squeezed my hand, finally showing some sign of marital support. But even that gesture came too late and too weak. In 8 years, she had never adequately defended me against her family's subtle attacks. She had learned to navigate the family's racism through comfortable denial. As long as the insults weren't explicit, she could pretend they didn't exist. Trayvon always knew his place in the family, Victoria said, adjusting her pearls with obvious satisfaction. Isn't that right, dear? You've always been very realistic about your place here. My place. As if I were a servant who had forgotten his position. I discreetly checked my watch again. 12:47. In less than 6 hours, when the family lawyer read James Thompson's will, these people would find out exactly what my real place was in the family dynamic. And it wasn't what any of them imagined. Well, I said calmly, I guess we'll all find out tonight. Victoria smiled condescendingly. Oh, I'm sure we will. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that James Thompson had sought me out 6 months before he died. Not to include a small memento in his will, as Victoria assumed. He had sought me out because he was facing a devastating financial crisis. Bad investments, mounting debt, overmortgaged properties. The Thompson family fortune was on the verge of complete collapse. And I had saved it all. Not out of charity or love for the family that despised me, but because I loved my wife and wanted to protect the legacy she thought she would inherit. While Victoria continued her show of racial superiority, mentally calculating how many zeros she expected to see in her inheritance, I thought about the private conversation I had had with James 3 months before his death. Trayvon, he had said, his voice heavy with shame and despair, you're the only one in the family with the real resources to save this. The others live on appearances. You've built something solid. He had discovered, through his own discreet investigations, that the son-in-law his family constantly belittled was actually richer than all the Thompsons combined. And now, as Victoria mentally planned how she would spend an inheritance that no longer existed, I silently watched the final act of a family that had completely underestimated the man they thought they could humiliate with impunity. The funeral was far from over. But for the Thompsons' arrogance, the last rites had already begun. Victoria's cruelty was not improvised, it was a system refined over 8 years. You know Trayvon, she continued, adjusting her black veil as she watched the guests shift uncomfortably, I've always wondered how you manage to remain so confident. Even though you know everyone here can see exactly what you are. The silence in the hall became suffocating. Even the sound of the air conditioning seemed amplified as 30 pairs of eyes watched my reaction. Some with morbid curiosity, others with vicarious embarrassment, but no one, absolutely no one, showing any intention of defending me. Victoria, please, Jessica finally murmured, but her voice was so low it was barely audible. Even this feeble protest was accompanied by an apologetic glance directed at her sister, as if she were asking forgiveness for defending me, not asking Victoria to stop attacking me. Oh, don't worry, Jess, Victoria laughed, her crystal-clear voice echoing off the mahogany walls. I'm sure Trayvon is used to it by now. After all, he must hear it constantly when he goes out trying to pass himself off as something he's not. Cousin Linda let out a muffled giggle, quickly disguised as a cough. Uncle Robert examined his fingernails intently. Grandma Dorothy, who had feigned selective deafness for years, suddenly seemed to be hearing every word with crystal clarity. "Victoria's right about one thing," said Cousin Linda, finding courage in collective cruelty. "Dad has always been very generous to people in unfavorable situations. But there are limits to family charity." Family charity. As if my marriage to Jessica were an act of philanthropy on the part of the Thompsons. "Especially considering," added Uncle Robert, finally looking up, "the financial responsibilities we're facing now. With Dad gone, we need to be more selective about where we invest our emotional and financial resources." Emotional resources. They were discussing my place in the family as if I were a budget expense that needed to be cut. Jessica squeezed my hand again, but the gesture felt more like an attempt to keep me calm than genuine support. She knew exactly where this conversation was going, and rather than interrupting it, she was trying to prepare me to accept the inevitable. What Robert is trying to say, Victoria took control again, is that certain family traditions may need to be re-evaluated. Christmas dinners, birthday gatherings, social events, all of these require a certain standard. Standard. The word hung in the air like poison. "And let's be honest," she continued, her voice taking on that tone of false concern I knew so well, "it must be awkward for you too. Trying to fit in where you clearly don't belong. Always having to explain your situation to people." My situation. My color. It was Cousin Linda who delivered the final blow. Perhaps it would be kinder for all of us to recognize that some differences are simply insurmountable. For 8 years, I had tolerated these taunts because I thought they were temporary exceptions. Isolated moments of prejudice that could be overcome with patience, diplomacy, and constant proof of my worth. But as I watched 30 members of the Thompson family silently agree to the racial expulsion being orchestrated at the patriarch's funeral, I realized I had been tragically naive. They never saw me as family. I was a temporary aberration they tolerated for Jessica's sake, secretly counting the days until she came to her senses and found someone more appropriate. "Well," said Victoria, interpreting my silence as defeat, "it's good that we're all on the same page. It will make things much simpler going forward." She looked around the room, collecting nods of approval like a politician counting votes. The decision was made. Family consensus had been reached. Trayvon would be kindly excluded from the Thompson dynasty, allowing them to keep their consciences clear while preserving their racial purity. It was at that moment that something broke inside me. Not my heart, that had been broken so many times it had developed calluses. Not my self-esteem. I had long ago learned to find validation in places other than my wife's family. What broke was my ability to pretend that this was a situation I should continue to tolerate. For 8 years, I had been the model son-in-law. Cordial at gatherings, generous with gifts, respectful of family traditions that subtly excluded me. I had swallowed insults, ignored taunts, and responded to cruelty with dignity, always hoping that my character would eventually win her respect. But while Victoria smiled with satisfaction, mentally organizing a finally clean Thompson family, I silently calculated how many zeros she thought she would see in her inheritance. "You're right, Victoria," I said calmly, rising from my chair. "Some differences really are insurmountable." My voice came out controlled, almost casual, but there was something in my posture that made her smile falter slightly. The difference between people who build empires and people who live on appearances. The difference between those who produce wealth and those who merely inherit it. The difference between those who save families and those who destroy them with arrogance. Victoria blinked, confused by the tone she didn't recognize. For 8 years, my voice had always carried deference when I spoke to her. Now there was something different, something that made Uncle Robert straighten in his chair and Cousin Linda stop laughing. "But you're right about one thing," I continued, checking my Patek Philippe again. "Today will truly mark the end of an era for the Thompson family." The clock read 1:23. In less than 5 hours, when the family lawyer read James Thompson's will, these people would discover that the man they had spent 8 years humiliating was the only reason they still had a legacy to inherit. And at that moment, while Victoria mentally reorganized her racial superiority and the other family members calculated how they would divide an inheritance that no longer existed, I made a decision that would forever change the dynamics of this family. I would no longer pretend to be small so that they could feel big. I would no longer hide my success to protect their fragile egos. And I would definitely no longer save people who despised me from the financial disasters they themselves had created. The reading of the will would only be the beginning. Because Victoria was right, some differences were truly insurmountable. The difference between those who deserve respect and those who merely demand obedience based on prejudice. Victoria's arrogance wasn't just prejudice, it was strategic stupidity. As she orchestrated my racial exclusion at the funeral of the man who had chosen me as the family's savior, I mentally calculated how many hours remained before she would discover the most humiliating truth of her life. 3 hours and 47 minutes. Trayvon, she continued, her voice taking on that condescending maternal tone I had learned to hate, I hope you understand that this isn't personal. It's just practical. Daddy was always too generous to outsiders. Outsiders. As if 8 years of marriage meant nothing. Of course it's practical, I agreed calmly, discreetly checking a message on my phone. It was from the family lawyer, confirming that all the documents were ready for review at 6 p.m. Financial decisions should always be practical. Victoria smiled, interpreting my agreement as submission. Cousin Linda let out a sigh of relief, as if she had feared I was going to make an embarrassing scene. Uncle Robert nodded approvingly, pleased to see order being restored to the family hierarchy. What none of them knew was that while they had spent the last 8 years treating me like a tolerated stranger, I had been meticulously documenting every interaction, every racist comment, every attempt at exclusion. Not out of paranoia, but out of professional necessity. My lawyers had advised me years ago to keep detailed records of any discrimination, especially considering the substantial sums I was investing in the preservation of this family. In fact, Victoria said, her confidence growing with my apparent passivity, we have some changes planned for the coming months. The will is just the beginning. She exchanged meaningful glances with Cousin Linda, who nodded with conspiratorial enthusiasm. We're thinking of selling the house, Victoria continued, and dividing everything among the real family members. It will be a new beginning for all of us. The house. The $2.4 million property that James Thompson had mortgaged 3 times in the last 5 years, trying to save disastrous investments in real estate development. The same house I had secretly purchased through a subsidiary company when the bank threatened to foreclose in March. Sell the family home, I repeated thoughtfully. Interesting. Do you already have a broker in mind? Oh, several options, Victoria laughed, clearly delighted to discuss her plans in front of me. The market is hot. We should get an excellent price. Cousin Linda leaned forward, unable to contain her cruel excitement. And best of all, we'll finally be able to have proper family gatherings. No worries about compatibility. Compatibility. Another euphemism for skin color. Jessica finally found the courage to speak up, but not in the way I expected. Victoria, maybe we should wait a few months before making such big decisions. Grief can. Grief doesn't change financial realities, Jess, Victoria interrupted firmly. Dad left some debts. We need to be practical. Some debts. They had no idea of the extent of the financial disaster James had created. $820,000 on credit cards. $1.5 million in personal loans secured against the house. Another $600,000 in lost investments he had hidden from the family for 2 years. Total, $2,920,000 in debt that would have completely destroyed the Thompson legacy. Debts that I had quietly paid off over the past 6 months, preserving the illusion of family prosperity that allowed Victoria to maintain her arrogance. Debts can be complicated, I remarked casually. Especially when they involve multiple creditors and complex collateral. Victoria waved dismissively. Nothing a good real estate sale can't fix. Dad was always too conservative. We know how to maximize returns. They knew how to maximize returns. 2 women who had never worked a day in real investment, talking about financial strategy like they were Wall Street experts. My phone vibrated again. A message from my wealth manager confirming that the final transfers had been processed. Officially, I now own not only the house, but also the remaining shares of the family business, 3 rental properties in Richmond, and the rights to a trust fund James had established for his grandchildren. All purchased at market value, all legal, all documented with forensic precision. You seem pensive, Trayvon, Victoria observed, interpreting my silence as melancholy. I know it must be hard to accept change, but sometimes it's necessary. You're right, I replied, putting my phone away. Change is inevitable, especially when people make assumptions based on incomplete information. Something in my tone made Cousin Linda frown slightly, but Victoria was too busy savoring her anticipated victory to notice the nuances. Exactly, she agreed triumphantly. And after today, we'll all finally be on the same page about the future of the Thompson family. The future of the Thompson family. If only she knew that future was entirely in the hands of the man she had spent 8 years trying to oust. At 3:30 p.m., I received the call I had been waiting for. Dr. Harrison, the family's lawyer for 23 years, confirming the final details for the reading of the will. Mr. Johnson, his voice carried a tone of respectful admiration that contrasted sharply with the treatment I received from the Thompsons. I must say that the steps you took were extraordinary. James died in peace knowing that his family was protected. It was the least I could do, I replied, watching Victoria mentally organize her list of future expenses. James was a good man who made some bad decisions. No one deserves to see their family legacy destroyed by financial mistakes. The will is prepared exactly as we discussed. The revelations will be shocking. Shocking was an understatement. In less than 3 hours, Victoria would discover that the man she considered a racial parasite had not only saved her inheritance but had technically become the financial patriarch of the family that rejected her. If you're following this journey of silent resistance and revelations that will completely transform a toxic family dynamic, don't miss the next episode, because when the truth finally comes out, no member of the Thompson family will be the same. While Victoria continued to plan a future based on completely false assumptions, I checked one last time the documents that would turn her arrogance into complete humiliation. The reading of the will would take place in the library of the house, the same house she was so eager to sell, unaware that it already belonged to the man she had just tried to expel from the family. In 2 hours and 50 minutes, Victoria Thompson would discover that underestimating someone based on the color of their skin had been the most costly mistake of her privileged life. And unlike all the other times I had silently absorbed her insults, this time I would not protect her ego from the devastating truth she had built with her own hands. The funeral was coming to an end. But for the Thompson family's racial superiority, the final rites were just beginning. At 6 p.m. sharp, Dr. Harrison arrived at the Thompson family library with a leather briefcase containing enough documents to completely rewrite the family hierarchy. Victoria had organized the meeting with the precision of a theater director, positioning herself in the patriarch's chair while distributing the other seats according to her new family order. Jessica to her right. Cousin Linda on her left. Uncle Robert by the fireplace. And me? I was directed to an isolated chair in the corner, far from the main table, like a tolerated guest who would soon be dismissed. Well, Dr. Harrison began, adjusting his glasses as he opened his briefcase, this will contain some surprises that James Thompson wanted to include in his final months of life. Victoria smiled with anticipatory satisfaction, already mentally calculating how she would spend her substantial inheritance. Cousin Linda discreetly checked her nails, waiting for her share of the division. Uncle Robert drummed his fingers on the table impatiently. Before I begin, Dr. Harrison continued, I must explain that this document was completely rewritten 6 months before James's death. He was concerned about certain financial discoveries. A flash of unease crossed Victoria's face, but she quickly disguised it. Financial discoveries? James Thompson was facing a severe liquidity crisis, Dr. Harrison explained methodically. $820,000 in credit card debt. $1.5 million in personal loans secured by this property. Another $600,000 in lost investments. The silence in the library became absolute. Victoria visibly paled. Cousin Linda stopped examining her fingernails. Uncle Robert froze completely. That's impossible, Victoria whispered. Dad was conservative. He was never honest about his financial situation, Dr. Harrison gently added. He hid the losses from the family for almost 2 years, hoping he could recover everything before anyone found out. Jessica grabbed my hand hard enough to hurt. Even she hadn't suspected the extent of her father's financial disaster. But that means, Cousin Linda began, her voice failing. That there is no traditional inheritance, Dr. Harrison confirmed. In fact, technically, the Thompson family was bankrupt at the time of James's death. Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. That's ridiculous. The house is worth $2 million. The investments, the company shares. All mortgaged or lost, Dr. Harrison said calmly. Except. He paused dramatically, looking directly at me. Except for the extraordinary financial interventions of a person James considered the true savior of the family. All eyes turned to me. Victoria frowned, confused. Interventions by whom? Dr. Harrison opened another set of documents. Over the past 6 months, someone has paid off all of James Thompson's debts. Purchased the mortgage on this house. Acquired the remaining shares of the family business. And established a substantial trust fund to preserve the Thompson legacy. Who did that? Victoria demanded, her voice rising an octave. Dr. Harrison smiled slightly. Trayvon Johnson. The silence that followed was so deep that I could hear my own heart beating. Victoria blinked several times, as if the words weren't being processed correctly by her brain. That's, she began, then stopped. Trayvon doesn't have that kind of money. He can barely. Actually, Dr. Harrison interrupted, Trayvon Johnson currently has more net worth than the entire Thompson family combined. His technology consulting firm was valued at $87 million last year. Cousin Linda let out a sound that was somewhere between a choke and a nervous laugh. Uncle Robert leaned forward, as if he hadn't heard correctly. Victoria stared at me with an expression of utter disbelief. You have a tech consulting firm? 3, actually, I replied calmly. Plus investments in 17 startups, properties in 5 states, and a diversified portfolio that James discovered when he was desperately looking for someone who could save him from bankruptcy. But you never said, Jessica whispered, her voice thick with shock. No one ever asked, I replied simply. In 8 years of marriage, how many times has anyone in this family asked me specifically about my work? About my projects? About anything other than confirming their assumptions about my inadequacy? Victoria opened and closed her mouth several times, like a fish out of water. But you drove that old Prius. Which I bought on purpose because no one questions the success of a black man driving a modest car. It avoids uncomfortable conversations and unnecessary suspicion. Dr. Harrison continued reading. According to this will, James Thompson acknowledges that his family only maintains its standard of living and social reputation thanks to the generosity of Trayvon Johnson. Therefore, he establishes Trayvon as the principal administrator of all family assets. Principal administrator? Victoria repeated, her voice rising to an almost hysterical tone. It means I technically own this house, I explained patiently. The company's shares. The trust fund. Everything you thought you would inherit, I bought to preserve the family dignity James feared losing. Uncle Robert finally found his voice. Why would you do that? After how we treated him. Cousin Linda finished, her previous arrogance replaced by growing horror. Victoria turned to me, her eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and despair. You knew. Throughout the funeral, you knew you owned everything and let you reveal exactly who you are when you thought you had power over me, I finished. Yes, I knew. The final truth was about to be revealed, forever changing the dynamics of a family that had built its entire identity around racial and financial superiority over the man who, ironically, had saved their legacy from complete destruction. Dr. Harrison closed the documents. There is one more special clause that James insisted on including. Victoria and the rest of the family waited, clearly fearing what devastating revelation would follow. But this would be only the first of several surprises that would completely transform their understanding of power, privilege, and the consequences of underestimating someone based on prejudices that completely blind them to reality. The special clause, Dr. Harrison continued, his voice taking on an almost solemn tone, states that any member of the Thompson family who demonstrates discriminatory or harmful behavior toward Trayvon Johnson will automatically forfeit their rights to the trust fund. Victoria froze completely. Cousin Linda visibly paled. Uncle Robert choked on his own air. James was very specific about this, Dr. Harrison explained methodically. He documented years of observations of racist comments, deliberate exclusions, and attempts at public humiliation directed at Trayvon. He considered this a fundamental violation of the family values he wished to preserve. But that was, Victoria began, then stopped, realizing that any denial would be an obvious lie in front of witnesses. Today, during the funeral, Dr. Harrison consulted his notes. Several people reported public comments about racial appropriateness and people like you directed specifically at Trayvon. According to the terms of the will, this constitutes a direct violation of the non-discrimination clause. The silence in the library became absolute. Victoria looked desperately around the room, seeking support, but found only faces that avoided her gaze. What does that mean, exactly? Jessica asked, her voice trembling. It means, Dr. Harrison replied calmly, that Victoria Thompson has forfeited all inheritance rights and is formally excluded from the family trust fund. Her share will be redistributed among the other beneficiaries who have demonstrated respectful behavior. Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair banging against the wall. This is absurd. You can't exclude me from my own family. Not from the family, Dr. Harrison corrected. From the financial benefits. James was very clear, character before blood. Cousin Linda tried to intervene. But Victoria was only expressing legitimate concerns about her sister's husband's skin color. Dr. Harrison interrupted her. James included audio recordings of the last 4 family meetings. Everything has been documented. The revelation of the recordings sent a shockwave through the room. Uncle Robert leaned forward, clearly calculating which of his own comments might have been recorded. Recordings. Victoria repeated, her voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. James had been aware of the discriminatory patterns for years, I explained calmly. He initially came to me not only for financial assistance, but to document what was happening. He wanted concrete evidence before taking legal action. Jessica stared at me with a mixed expression of admiration and horror. You knew about the recordings? I suggested the recordings, I replied simply. After the third comment about how I should be grateful for getting a white wife, I recommended that James document everything to protect the interests of the genuinely tolerant family. Victoria began pacing the library, her refined composure completely crumbling. You can't do this to me. I'm a Thompson by birth. And I'm a Thompson by choice, I replied calmly. The difference is that I chose to protect this family when it needed it, while you chose to try to destroy it out of prejudice. Dr. Harrison opened another envelope. There's more. James established a college scholarship program in the family's name, focused specifically on students who face racial discrimination. The initial fund is $2 million. $2 million that should be ours. Victoria exploded, completely losing control. $2 million that I provided, I corrected firmly. The money you think you should inherit is literally my money, invested to save a family that despised me. Cousin Linda finally found the courage to speak, her voice trembling. Trayvon, we didn't know. If we had known you had resources, would you have been respectful? I asked directly. Should respect depend on my bank statement? The silence that followed answered my question more eloquently than any words could have. Uncle Robert tried a different approach. Maybe we can start over. Forget past misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. I repeated, my voice taking on a harshness that made him recoil. 8 years of comments about my inadequacy, 8 years of subtle exclusions, 8 years of humiliation disguised as family jokes. Are those misunderstandings? Jessica squeezed my hand, finally understanding the extent of what I had endured in silence. Trayvon, why didn't you ever tell me about my company? Because no one asked specifically. When I tried to mention my projects, you changed the subject or made jokes about my entrepreneurial phase. Dr. Harrison consulted his watch. There is one last issue to address. James has requested a private meeting between Trayvon and each family member to discuss the future of our relationships. Victoria laughed bitterly. What future? He destroyed us financially. I saved you from bankruptcy, I corrected patiently. The financial destruction happened when James lost $3 million in bad investments. I just provided a safety net you didn't even know you needed. And now? Cousin Linda asked, her previous hostility replaced by a mixture of fear and curiosity. Now you make choices, I replied, standing up. You can continue to believe that you deserve respect by accident of birth. Or you can learn that dignity is built through character. Dr. Harrison organized his documents. Individual meetings can be scheduled at Trayvon's convenience. Until then, the terms of the will are in effect. Victoria made one last desperate attempt. Jessica, are you going to let your husband destroy your own family? Jessica looked at me, then at her sister, and for the first time in 8 years, she clearly chose a side. Victoria, you spent 8 years trying to convince me that my husband wasn't good enough for our family. Now I find out he's the only reason we still have a family. The defeat on Victoria's face was complete. Not just financially, but emotionally. Her own sister had chosen the man she had tried to drive away. The individual meetings, I said calmly, are opportunities for honest conversations about mutual respect. For those who demonstrate genuine growth, there will be opportunities to rebuild relationships based on equality, not condescending tolerance. Cousin Linda nodded hesitantly. Uncle Robert muttered something about reconsidering perspectives. Even Victoria, in her defeat, seemed to be calculating whether genuine humility could restore some access to family benefits. Dr. Harrison prepared to leave. Trayvon, you have complete control over how to manage the family legacy. James trusted your judgment completely. After the lawyer left, we remained silent in the library that now officially belonged to me, along with the rest of the Thompson estate. 8 years, Jessica whispered finally. For 8 years, I let them treat you like a temporary intruder, I finished gently. But Jessica, you are not responsible for their prejudice. You are only responsible for your own choices from now on. Victoria, who had been silent for several minutes, finally spoke, her voice broken. Are you really going to exclude us? After all these years? I'm not excluding anyone, I replied calmly. I just no longer tolerate disrespect disguised as family tradition. Anyone who chooses to treat people with dignity, regardless of color, is welcome. Anyone who can't do that, well, James was clear about the consequences. In the months that followed, family dynamics completely transformed. Cousin Linda was the first to request a private meeting, where she candidly admitted to years of prejudiced behavior and asked for guidance on how to rebuild a relationship based on genuine respect. Uncle Robert took longer, but eventually acknowledged that he had confused preserving traditions with maintaining racial privilege. Our monthly dinners became open discussions about unconscious bias and personal growth. Jessica began therapy to process her own complicity in the family system that diminished me. Our marriage grew stronger as she learned to see me not as someone she needed to defend, but as an equal partner who deserved unconditional respect. It took Victoria almost a year to agree to a meeting. When it finally happened, she cried genuinely as she recognized the impact of her actions. It wasn't instant forgiveness. Some wounds take time to heal, but it was the beginning of real transformation. The college scholarship program became my greatest source of pride. 23 students received full support in the first year, all facing discrimination similar to what I had experienced. Seeing talented young people get opportunities that were almost denied them because of prejudice validated every difficult moment I endured in silence. The family business was restructured with strict diversity and inclusion policies. We implemented mandatory training, diversity committees, and clear metrics to measure progress. The business thrived in ways the previous generation could never have imagined. 2 years later, during a Christmas dinner in the same library where everything had been revealed, Victoria stood up to make a toast. To the man who saved our family, she said, her voice steady, not just financially, but morally. Trayvon, thank you for having the patience to teach us the difference between tradition and prejudice. It was a moment of coming full circle that James Thompson would have approved of. A family that learned to value character over color, merit over pedigree, growth over stagnation. If this story of resilience, transformation, and justice touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of people who turned discrimination into an opportunity for real change. Because sometimes, the greatest power isn't in fighting fire with fire, but in raising the entire standard of the conversation. The last time Victoria tried to make a comment about people like me, she stopped mid-sentence, corrected herself, and apologized immediately. Not out of fear of financial consequences, but out of genuine understanding of the impact of her words. My name is Trayvon. At 34, I've learned that the sweetest revenge isn't to humiliate those who humiliate us, but to demonstrate through example that we can all be better than our worst impulses. And today, when I look around the table during family gatherings, I see not just polite tolerance, but genuine respect, authentic conversations, and a family that has finally learned to see beyond the surface. James Thompson died in peace because he knew he had found someone capable of saving not only the family estate, but the very soul of the family that had lost its way. Sometimes the greatest victory is not proving them wrong about you, but helping them discover who they could be if they chose to be right.